Next speaker is Professor Erika Rappaport from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Erika could unfortunately not join us in person, but she's here with us on Zoom. She stayed up very late in California, and hopefully she drinks a lot of coffee, as she promised me. And we have a recording of her commentary. We wanted to avoid technical difficulties, so we'll now listen to her recording, and she can later join us in the discussion.
Hi everybody, I want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this book launch of a book that is just a phenomenal book, but also one that I personally have been waiting for a book like this for a long time. And so really it's exciting to be part of this conversation, and I'm sorry that I can't be with you here in person, but I will be there live for our discussion, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So what I plan to do is read my comments that I wrote, and then I'll be joining you live for the discussion of the book. Okay, so I'd like to begin in 1963, when David Ogilvy published what immediately became an iconic text, Confessions of an Advertising Man. Described in his foreword as a slender but juicy book, Confessions included commandments for simple rules of how to get and keep clients, how to build great campaigns, and how to write potent copy. After offering such profitable advice, Ogilvy ended his book on a very hesitant note with a chapter that asked, should advertising be abolished? Evidently, conversations with Lady Hendy, Ogilvy's socialist elder sister, inspired the chapter. And it probably inspired his conclusion as well, because he concluded the book by suggesting that opinion on advertising is still divided. One of the most famous advertisers of his day, writing in the boom years of the early 1960s, Ogilvy still expressed a sense of discomfort with a profession that had skated so close to the edge of fraud. Confessions of an Advertising Man was written in part to resolve his qualms and raise the status of the profession. It did so basically by asserting that good advertisements were truthful information. He thus challenges his colleagues to give up what he calls flatulent puffery and write informative advertising. Ogilvy's misgivings also plagued the Victorians under the subject of Anat Rosenberg's wonderful new book, The Rise of Mass Advertising, Law, Enchantment, and the Cultural Boundaries of British Modernity. Thanks to Anat, we can imagine the conversations that Ogilvy must have had with his sister, as they explored the boundaries of fact and fiction and discussed the varied benefits and pitfalls of capitalism versus socialism. We can also understand their significance, since Anat's book provides a genealogy of such conversations and the logic behind Ogilvy's truth claims and his anxieties. Rather than taking sides in the pervasive debate about the morality and power of advertising, Rosenberg has cast her critical eye on the debate itself. She demonstrates how advertisements and the debate about their value reveal core concerns about modernity in 19th century England. For the Victorians, much like Ogilvy and his sister, advertising raised profound anxieties about disciplinary, social, and cultural boundaries. Advertising was disruptive because it challenged older forms of value and symbolized how industrial and consumer capitalism were seemingly disenchanting the modern world. Rather than trace the rise of mass advertising in the 19th century, Anat does something much more compelling. She highlights how the debate about the rise of mass advertising was at the very center of key issues of Victorian society, and that debate did a great deal of what she calls cultural boundary work. She demonstrates how the marginal social status of advertisers and the denunciations of advertisements as degraded yet powerful form of knowledge were arenas in which men and women articulated and attempted to draw the line between fact and fiction, art and industry, and science and property. There's no question that people living prior to the 19th century were equally concerned about how new material cultures and economic systems challenge stable hierarchies and knowledge systems. However, Rosenberg emphasizes the contradictory ways in which a liberalizing legal regime, beginning in the 1840s and closing with the onset of the First World War, simultaneously unleashed and contained the destabilizing nature of mass culture in all its forms. In her study, the law operates on multiple levels as it endeavors, as Rosenberg explains, to formulate, quote, social meanings, resolve cultural dilemmas, and frame normativity with the backing of legitimate coercive power. Changing legal foundations for advertising in the mass media disrupted existing frameworks as much as the nucleus that filled the shelves of Victorian retailers. This point is especially clear in Chapter 2, which focuses on the commercialization of newspapers. The removal of the so-called taxes on knowledge between 1853 and 1861 allowed for the huge expansion of the mass press and mass advertising, as is well known. Rather than assert that liberal legal reforms created a free market of ideas, Rosenberg does a close reading of the repeal debate, and the organizational work of reform groups such as the Newspaper Stamp Abolition Committee and the Association for the Promotion of the Repeal of the Taxes on Knowledge. She shows how such reformers set many of the terms of the debate around advertising, and how they pushed the notion that advertising was legitimate market information. Rosenberg concludes this chapter by highlighting the somewhat ironic fact, as she puts it, that radical politics helped legitimize advertising and the culture of consumption that was emerging in the 19th century. The liberal radicals that Rosenberg describes were not unlike, I would argue, members of the cooperative movement, which also began in the 1840s and promised that by cutting out the retailer and refusing to advertise their wares, they were bringing lower price and better quality goods to their working class members. Cooperators explicitly critiqued capitalist modes of retailing, but as historians have shown, they made peace with advertising and large-scale retailing, and were even responsible for business innovations that helped expand the mass market. As important, cooperation helped the working class and radicals in Britain come to terms with their consumer desires. Rosenberg helps us understand how and why such tensions surrounding the new mass market remained so present in British radical politics throughout the 19th and into the 20th centuries. In doing so, she reveals how avid Britons confronted a new world of goods, visually and materially, in a riot of advertising that appeared on signs, posters, print, and packaging. Rosenberg's study significantly redirects British scholarship on advertising, which until the 1990s had virtually not existed, but especially if we look in comparison to the scholarship in the United States. So in the US, historians such as Jackson Lears, Roland Marchand, Charles McGovern, and many others have argued that studying advertising and advertisers provides a way to understand how Protestant America came to terms with and contained the desires unleashed by the growth and transformations in capitalism in the 19th century, and then on into the 20th century. In Britain, historians tended to neglect the subject altogether. Instead, you have literary scholars and cultural theorists, such as Rachel Bowlby, who we'll be hearing from, Thomas Richards, and others, who inspired historians, such as myself, to investigate how advertising disrupted, but also reinforced class, gender, and racial norms and boundaries. In London's West End, for example, I demonstrated how magnificent new department stores advertise themselves as public, pleasurable spaces for bourgeois women. Well, this seemed to disrupt neat boundaries between public and private. It did not fundamentally reshape. It may have actually fixed class and gender divisions. The advertising and purchase of mundane and everyday goods also worked to solidify notions of racial difference. Victorian soap advertising, which has been much studied, for example, has promised personal renewal and revival by relying on racial boundaries and fantasies of imperial conquest. Rosenberg Rosenberg builds on such studies, but instead of looking at advertising as part of the process of identity formation, she provides a broad reading of the patterns in advertising and examines it as intellectual history. She also, very importantly, introduces the legal archive as a place in which we can see how ordinary men and women read advertising, how they talked about their use of goods, how they understood markets, and so much more. By using this archive and the history of law in general, Rosenberg has revealed everyday worlds of consumer capitalism, and I would argue provided a method for further comparative analysis. So my key question that I want to raise for discussion, and which sits at the center of scholarship on advertising in Britain, is how this study would have looked different, perhaps, if Anat had studied imperial rather than domestic growth. Rosenberg certainly acknowledges the empire as a framework, as a source of commodities, as a topic for Orientalist and racist narratives in advertising. But how did colonial legal systems, which were highly pluralistic, build on or depart from metropolitan law regarding advertisements? Scholars are increasingly looking at such topics, and soon I think we'll have a more robust historiography to understand the geographies of the British world of mass advertising. I'm not asking or really interested in simply adding more settings and context from the empire, but rather I think Rosenberg provides a method for detailed comparative study within and beyond the British Empire. Her book points to new archives, as I mentioned, and new tools for understanding the cultural work of advertising in colonial settings, for understanding the workings of colonial capitalism, and for reconceptualizing anti-colonial movements. So, of course, we know that at least since the American Revolution, consumer boycotts have been central to the rejection of British imperialism. But can we also, using Anat's kind of insights, can we also think about anti-colonialism as a form of cultural and intellectual critique of capitalism, advertising, and the mass market? Can we think of anti-colonial movements as part of the conversation that Anat shows did such important cultural and disciplinary work in the Victorian method? I'm going to suggest that this is indeed the case. In my most recent book on the history of tea, for example, I dwelled upon a very short, unknown, small essay which Gandhi wrote in 1935 and entitled Untruthful Advertising. In this essay, Gandhi took on the British-owned tea industry and charged that its advertising was a problematic form of colonialism. He asked Indians not to give up drinking tea, but rather to learn how to read advertising critically, to avoid assuming that, quote, the printed word in a book or newspaper is the gospel truth. As an example of this problem of kind of naive reading of advertising, Gandhi quoted a recent advertisement in a Bengali newspaper that proposed, quote, tea helps retain a youthful look and energy. The ad then described how a 48-year-old man looked a mere 34, because since he had been 14 years old, he had drunk nearly 30 cups of tea a day. The ad, which looked like, quote, this is in Gandhi's words, a report from the paper's own correspondent, provided what Gandhi thought was an example of the fictional world of commodity culture. For Gandhi, such advertising was dangerous on two fronts. It broke a kind of contract between reader and text by mimicking the style of the news sections of the newspaper, and by inviting consumers to commit self-violence, which in this case he defined as buying things they did not need. With its state support and wide reach, the tea campaign stood out as a particularly egregious example of how commodity culture was a form of colonialism. Strong tea, like the British Empire, Gandhi concluded, was quite simply poisoned. If we take Anat Rosenberg as our guide, we can understand Gandhi's essay and the Swadeshi movement more broadly in a new way, and see it as a rejection, of course, of colonialism, but also of capitalism and its modern enchantments. We can also put Gandhi in conversation with David Ogilvy and Lady Hendy, and see how these three were all engaged in fundamental cultural work. They were not merely selling or rejecting goods or advertising, but wrestling with the boundaries of both truth and fiction. This is the problem that we all confront every time we look at social media, read a newspaper, watch a television show, or simply walk down a crowded city street. Advertising, as we see in Rosenberg's book, is a window into how we all participate in the fantasy life of capitalism as consumers and as critics. Thank you.